Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming on this miserable night. When we thought about doing this program, we really had no idea that the night we did it would be the night that Donald Trump is the sole candidate of the Republican Party. I'm still wondering which country to move to after this election. But of course, the French-American Foundation is always prescient about issues between France and the United States. But I have to say, this really was pure luck. I'm looking forward to hearing from our panelists, because I certainly have no idea what's going on in this country, but I know they do. My name's Alan Chapin. I'm the chairman of the foundation. We have a great panel here this evening, and as chairman, my job is to introduce Rick MacArthur and get out of the way. Rick is president and publisher of Harper's Magazine, an award-winning journalist, author, and is fluent in French as well. You know all about us. We were founded 40 years ago in New York and Paris by Giscard and Ford. We're running a gala to celebrate that in a couple of weeks. We try our best to enrich the relationship that's essential in today's world. I don't know what we're going to do if we have President Trump and President Le Pen, but it'll be an interesting time. So without any more, I want to turn this over to Rick. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Can you all hear me? We don't need amplification. Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to moderate this discussion, and I will let Gilles Ivaldi and Martin Shane do most of the talking, but I feel obliged to upset at least part of the premise and title right off the bat, since populism in America has two distinct tendencies. One is on the left, going back to the late 19th century, and one's on the right, and has all sorts of antecedents, some of them racist, some of them nationalist and isolationist, and some of them very left-sounding and anti-Wall Street and Washington, anti-federal government. So even though everyone is dying to talk about Donald Trump and Marine Le Pen, I'm going to ask Gilles and Martin also to discuss populism and the left as represented by Bernie Sanders and Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Sanders and Trump, as you may know, agree broadly on several important points, and Mélenchon, who is again running for president, finds himself in some tactical difficulty since Le Pen, at least for now, can in some sense run to Mélenchon's left on issues like the European Union and the Euro, and on the whole notion of democratic self-government. Now, that being said, I have a big investment in the Trump-Le Pen comparison, since we have a piece in the May issue of Harper's Magazine about Marine Le Pen, and as you'll see when you grab your free copy on the way out or on the way in, we titled it The Rise of France's Trump. And I confess that we're trying to sell copies by making the comparison, and I urge you to subscribe, but that doesn't necessarily make it inaccurate. Let's start, however, with Gilles' presentation on Marine Le Pen and the French political situation today. He's going to speak for about 15 minutes, and then Martin is going to talk about Trump and other things for about 15 minutes. Then I get to ask questions for 15 minutes, and then at 7:30 we'll open it up to the floor and wind things up around 8. So,
thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you to the French-American Foundation for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here in New York. Lovely weather. Change from Nice. So you've asked me to talk about the Marine Le Pen and the current situation of the FN in France. So just to remind you that in 2014, as you all know, the FN won the European elections in France with a quarter of the vote. And last December, they won the regional elections with 27% of the vote, and they were very close to winning 2 major regions in France. And it's only because we have this, we call the Republican Front, the alliance between the mainstream parties to block the FN, that we we avoided this. So this means that the FN is currently very high in polls and voting intentions, and the party has bright prospects for 2017. And I will talk about that later. For the party itself, I think what is interesting is you've all heard about the so-called dédiabolisation, which in English would be de-demonization, which refers to this attempt by Marine Le Pen to somewhat detoxify the party and its moral reputation. And I think we should be very careful because, in fact, de-demonization goes a long way back to the mid-90s when Bruno Maigret, a former FN member and vice president, wanted to do the same. And actually what they're trying to achieve is something a bit more subtle and complex than trying simply to turn the party into a less radical party. They're trying to achieve the right balance between being a radical right populist party on the one hand, and on the other hand to get more credibility and become more mainstream, more acceptable, more respectable. And the whole equation for Marine Le Pen in France at the moment is to try to balance those two very different sets of values and strategic ways, in a sense, to achieve the best or to maximize electoral opportunities. So we are looking at this very typical situation, and I think the same probably applies to Donald Trump in the US. He's trying to achieve this balance between being populist and radical, but at some stage he will have to become more mainstream and more acceptable. So now if we just briefly look at why the FN is so successful in France at the moment, well, there are different factors. Some of them are quite structural. The first factor, of course, is the economic crisis and unemployment, which has been basically rising since 2008 in France. At the moment, there is very strong, very deep popular discontent with the Hollande's presidency. I mean, Hollande, as you know, is achieving the worst presidential ratings ever by a French president since de Gaulle. The third factor, obviously, is the EU refugee crisis, which has triggered all sorts of immigration fears in France, and not only in France, because we see that the refugee crisis has become a very, very salient issue, very important issue in many European countries. And in France at the moment, public opinion is very much against, taking more refugees in. I think it's 2/3 of the French at the moment. We say we cannot take refugees in. We're talking about a few thousand people, not huge numbers like in Germany, but still, public opinion is very much against refugees and taking more in. And of course, the last factor is the terrorist attacks in Paris. And we've seen that very clearly around the regional elections, because if you look at the polls before the November attacks and after the November attacks, clearly there was a major boost for the FN, anywhere between 3 to 5 points. So I think the regional success was meant to be, but was clearly further intensified by the attacks and the impact. And of course now, Marine Le Pen has been able to link issues like, correlate or create a relationship between immigration, refugee crisis, and Islamic terrorism in France. People who vote for the FN, the FN is successful for all the factors that I've just mentioned. Let's say, to put things simply, that the FN right now is bringing together 3 different types of voters, or 3 electoral constituencies. The first one is the most obvious. It's the, let's call them the crisis-ridden voters. Those people who are often referred to as the globalization losers, people who suffer from the economic crisis, from economic globalization, who feel threatened both culturally and economically by immigration. And that's why at the moment the FN has a very, very strong working class basis, is doing very well with the unemployed, with people in the lower salary and people who are in the most popular categories, in the lower social strata. That's the first and probably the biggest group in FN voters. I think what Marine Le Pen is trying to achieve is to enlarge this electoral support and reach all the the former naysayers of the 2005 referendum. And Euroscepticism, as you know, has become a very, very important part of the FN supply or program. And I think in 2012 there were some studies which showed that actually Eurosceptic voters were really in the majority for the FN, and that Euroscepticism was the most important factor of voting for the FN, even before immigration. That tells you how important, rejecting the EU has become for people who vote for the FN and for the party itself, which, as you know, is leading the anti-EU coalition now in the European Parliament with other parties in Europe. And then there's a third group of voters, which is a more recent one, and I think those people have come to the FN probably in 2014 with European elections. And these are disgruntled conservative voters, people who were with the former UMP or now the Republicans, and who've been extremely dissatisfied or very angry because of all the internal disorder within the UMP, the fact that they couldn't elect a leader, they had no program whatsoever. And I think those people, they've turned to the FN. And clearly, if you look at the vote transfers between 2014, 2015, you can see quite a number, about, I think, about 20% of people who had voted for Nicolas Sarkozy, the right-wing leader in 2012, who have fled to the FN recently. So I think right now Marine Le Pen is very successful in attracting all those groups of voters. So you can see this makes quite a heterogeneous coalition of people who support the FN, and that's why the party is so successful now, because they managed to bring together people with very, very different backgrounds and attitudes. So now, what about 2017, and what are the prospects for the FN? Well, obviously, this is a very propitious context, and you may follow the news in France, and all polls at the moment say that Marine Le Pen should probably get anywhere between 25 to 30% of the vote, which is a lot. Recall that she got less than 18 in 2012, which means that there will be a substantial increase in electoral support for the FN in the presidential. The same polls tell us that she's very likely to make it to the second round, which of course will be another very important political earthquake in France and something major. And then again, the FN will be therefore capable to exert its, what we say in French, pouvoir de nuisance power, or disruptive power, by actually depriving the left, because it's clearly the left that would be the main loser in that story. So that's what the polls tell us at the moment. But I think there are a few obstacles in Marine Le Pen's way to power, and I think I'll finish with those. First, there are problems with the party itself, because right now, despite all those electoral successes, the FN is still perceived by the French as a far-right party. And Marine Le Pen has been very successful in changing the image of the party, the perception by the public. But in the end, the latest polls show that about 56% of the French still see the FN as a major threat to French democracy. So the whole de-demonization process is only at the very beginning. It's only starting, and we are far from a transformation into a more conservative or more classic or more mainstream right-wing conservative party. The second thing is the FN has been suffering from internal factionalism and the dispute between Marine Le Pen and Jean-Marie Le Pen. I mean, it's not something which is very important, but in the end, for some voters, the fact that Jean-Marie Le Pen has been expelled from the party, that he is trying to run his own organization, or at least his own strand within French politics, means that for some old voters who were supporters of the FN, this might count, and they might just change vote in 2017. And of course, you may have read, and I'm sure you've talked about that in your magazine, about all the financial scandals which have affected the FN recently. And I think in the end, these two may count in 2017. But there are more important factors why maybe the FN won't be that successful. The first one is the clear lack of economic credibility, because at the moment, you know, the FN has built its economic program on euro exit and the plan to actually shed the euro and return to the French franc. And this is supported only by 25% of the French, which means that for the FN, there'll be a problem of credibility in 2017, especially if Marine Le Pen makes it to the second round. She will have to, you know, convince people that she can actually run the government and the French economy. And right now, most French people just think she can't. She doesn't have the capacity to do that. And this Euro exit thing is actually taking many voters away from the FN, especially the older voters who are very, very wary of you know, what leaving the Euro would mean for France. So that's a major impediment for the French Front National. The second problem is the what in political science we refer to as the cost of de-radicalizing the party, because we know that when radical parties, they move to the center, they tend to lose votes. So for the FN, and you've seen that Marine Le Pen now is playing a more, you know, moderate tone, and she's referring as the France apaisée. I don't know how to say that in English, actually. A more peaceful France, or something quieter.
Yeah,
And I think this is a very interesting strategy, because her father tried to do the same back in 2007, tried to appear more moderate and more calm and quiet, and it didn't work out very well for him. So I think there might be this cost of, you know, trying to take the center back, the DFN back to the center. The third factor, which I think is very important, is that the FN has no coalition potential. I mean, the party may be very successful, but in the end, it is a very isolated party. And you know that the way French politics work, and especially our majoritarian system, which is based on two-round elections, you need to be able to build a coalition with other parties to win elections. And we've seen in the regional election, but even before that, in the local elections, the former canton, which are now called the departmental elections, that the FN had no potential alliance on the right side of the French political spectrum, which means that for Marine Le Pen, even if she makes it to the second round, then she's on her own. And that's a major problem. And of course, this will be even more of a problem in the legislatives, because once the whole presidential run is over, then we turn to the legislatives. And for the FN, it's a major problem. And then the last factor, and that would be the end of my presentation, is that we know that Marine Le Pen has taken the FN very much to the left on the economy. And that made sense in the post-crisis, you know, context in France, because French voters, the whole policy mood was very much in favor of redistribution and protectionism, and, you know, being closer to the people, and more leftist policies. And she's been very successful in doing that. But now, it might be the case that in 2017, this same policy mood in France will shift back to the right. And the way I see things at the moment is that there is a growing demand for more liberal, more market liberal policies in France. And the way, for instance, the Republicans, all the contenders for the primary next year, they're actually taking their program very much to the right in the economy. And I'm wondering whether in 2017, another thing that would make things difficult for Marine Le Pen is that many voters, they will be in demand for more market liberal policies. And right now, Marine Le Pen, because of the influence of Philippot and other people in the party, is very much stuck with those leftist policies. And that might be a bit of a problem for her.
Okay. I just realized I didn't introduce anybody properly. Gilles is a political scientist at the National Center for Scientific Research, the CNRS in France, and is currently, you teach at Université de Nice?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. And then Martin is a professor of politics at New York University, and the author of, I assume among other things, The Politics of Immigration in France, Britain, and the United States. So, Martin.
How does this thing go on?
I don't know. Doesn't seem to be on. Mine's,
Never mind.
mine's illuminated. Here, I'll put mine next to you. You can hear it. There you go.
I can speak.
There you go.
I can speak.
Okay, I think that'll work.
Anyway, I wanted to thank you for inviting me, and I'm
Yeah.
particularly pleased to be on the panel with my colleagues to my left. In the few minutes that I have, I want to talk about two things. The first is I'm a comparativist. I work in comparative politics, and I want to talk about some similarities between the Trump phenomenon and the phenomenon of Front National. And the second thing, actually more to the point, is I want to focus, rather than on issue-driven questions, I want to focus on something broader, and that is the new context of American politics that has been emerging for the last decade or more. So let me start with the first. And the first actually was more fun because I just sat down and I thought about it and tried to make some sense out of it. The first similarity that I would focus on is that both the Trump phenomenon, or actually now the Trump candidacy, and the Front National phenomenon are similar in the sense that they have strong working class support. For many years now, Front National has been the most important working class party in France, sometimes in rivalry with the socialists, but depending on how well the socialists do. But this has been a long-term phenomenon for Front National, and it obviously is also it also is part of the strong base of Trump's support. But also young voters. Both have attracted high percentages of young voters in recent years, indicating some of the alienation of young voters on both sides of the Atlantic. Thirdly, the strong negative opposition of voters who say that they would never vote for Front National, would never vote for Trump. And this is it's a very, very important thing. Gilles alluded to it a few minutes ago, and I would focus on it again, and that is what we now in America call the negatives of Front National. The negatives of Trump are really very important in terms of first winning and then developing coalitions. There are also elites on the right, of course, who would not form alliances with him. This has been true, as you mentioned. This has certainly been true for well over 15 years in the case of the National Front. But it appears to be true, although one is not so sure, for Donald Trump as well. Fourthly, both Marine Le Pen and Donald Trump have ambivalent positions on a number of social issues, which in America we would call a kind of, or that's what conservatives have called, a kind of drifting to the left, particularly on questions of abortion and gay marriage. For Marine Le Pen, in many ways, this is related, that is taking these kinds of positions, ambivalent positions on these issues, is related to development of an anti-Islam coalition, which is very similar to what happened with PIM 14 in the Netherlands back at the beginning of this past decade. That is to develop a social group which would seem naturally designed to vote for the left and get them to vote for the right by focusing on anti-Islam. But also, both candidates, both of them have run against established elites. That's part of their stock and trade. And they have become ascendant in the process. So that in the process of becoming ascendant, they have alienated people they would otherwise have to make coalitions with. Unlike the old radical right in pre-war and post-war, just post-war Europe, the National Front has accepted, as Donald Trump has accepted, the democratic system without attacking the existing regime and without saying that we must change the regime in order to gain justice. But they've also complained that their rivals, in each case on the right, have rejected the verdict of democracy. So they've used this populism without at the same time attacking the regime itself. And finally, it's something I don't want to let pass, that in each case there is a streak of authoritarian populism that is evident in, for example, the response of Trump supporters to a Kinnipack survey for last month, where the question was, what we need is, one, a leader who is willing to say or do anything to solve America's problems. And among Trump supporters, 54% agreed totally, and another 30% agreed somewhat. And the second question that came up in that survey last month was, my beliefs and values are now under attack. And Trump supporters, 76% of Trump supporters agreed with that totally. Another 15% agreed with that somewhat less than totally. So that we're dealing with an electorate that in fact is not just alienated, but is alienated in specific ways, in ways that seem to echo in authoritarian values. But what I really wanted to focus on more specifically is the new context of politics in the United States. The post-war model of American stability that I and many people in this room, no doubt, became aware of when they were studying political science at university was that America was stable because at the elite level there was a lack of polarization. During the good old days, roughly 60% of representatives and senators voted with their partisan colleagues, that is only a majority of the time. The other part of the time, they voted with the other party and formed coalitions based on issues. Straight party divisions during this period were really very, very rare. This has all changed, but let me go a little bit further. Votes on major issues were compromises, for better or worse, and those of us who studied political science back in those days argued that, well, America can't make decisions. The result was immobilism and long cycles of change. And the American Political Science Association, back in the mid-1950s, published a series of articles which were called Towards a More Responsible Two-Party System, in which they argued the best of all possibilities would be a British-type system. They weren't thinking of France. Would be a British-type system in which parties had programs that they would then have majorities that then could be put through. There would be a strong presidency with a strong majority behind it. Well, that's what we all wished for. And in some sense, that's what we got. Political sociologists argued in the 1950s through the 1960s that what can account for stability in the United States, moreover, was the effects of political participation. The more people participated in politics, they argued, with data, of course, the less ideological they became. And therefore, the ideologues, to the extent that there were ideologues in the United States, were masses of people who the assumption was the masses can be dangerous, because, and therefore, the more people participated, the less ideology there was, the less polarization there was. And in this sense, participation had a moderating impact. Now, this is what's changed. What's basically changed, you can see in a Pew survey that was published also last month. In this survey, what was revealed was that the most engaged people were first the most ideologically consistent, but second, were the most polarized around differences rather than common commitments. Now, this is really a very troubling thing, because if this was the core of stability in the United States, we can see this changing over a 10 to 15 year period. Growing percentages of Republicans and Democrats, 36% in the case of Republicans, 27% in the case of Democrats, see the opposition as a threat to our national well-being. And this percentage increases among those who are most involved. So, for example, among those who always vote, 56% of Republicans and half of the Democrats see the opposition party as a threat to our national well-being. And you can take this a step further. Those who contribute money are even more committed in this way. That is 54, or similarly committed in this way. That is 54% of Republicans, 47% of Democrats who contribute money because they see the opposition party as a threat to our national well-being. And finally, the final thing that the poll revealed was the extent to which people want to spend time with, live with, and be with those who are like-minded in terms of politics. Conservatives, for example, 50% want to live with other conservatives. Liberals, 35% want to live with other liberals. Similarly, 63% of conservatives say my closest friends share my values. And among liberals, half of them say my closest friends share my political values. So what struck me about this when I saw this survey, thinking about this issue, was that what this is most similar to is post-war European politics. But as you go through some of the studies that were done of European politics in the 1950s to the early 1960s, you find exactly the same thing. That ideological distance increases with participation, a lack of trust among partisans of different persuasions. When Europeans were asked during this period, 1959, 1960, 1961, how they would feel about their children marrying somebody of the other party, there were huge percentages who rejected that possibility. And the problem is that in Europe, this was often combined with weak support for political institutions. When Europeans were asked whether they supported the political institutions of their country, whether it was France or Italy, not so much in the UK, but to an extent in the UK as well, they supported the institutions of their country when their party was in power. When the opposition was in power, they weren't so sure. So when the other guys controlled government, there was deep-seated doubt about both the effectiveness and the legitimacy of the political institutions involved. So the question I pose to you now, and I'll just leave it hanging for a while, is given what we've learned both about American political opinion, its evolution during the past 15 years, and the growing attitudes among political participants and political elites in the United States, whether or not we are, I'm asking you really to contemplate whether or not we are approaching Europe in the post-war period in this sense.
Okay? So you get to answer a question. You'll have to, well, at the end, or toward the end. So I just want to get to my right-left questions right away. And the first one, I'll start on the right, and ask both of you whether you see in Donald Trump or Marine Le Pen fascist tendencies or fascist origins. And just to get the ball rolling, Robert Paxton, the great historian of Vichy France and of fascism, was asked about this. Actually, I saw him at a party, and he said, absolutely not, this is completely different. But then I read this interview with him in Slate, and he says, it's enormously tempting to say that Trump is or does have fascist tendencies. He says, quote, first of all, there are the kinds of themes Trump uses, the use of ethnic stereotypes and exploitation of fear of foreigners is directly out of a fascist recipe book. Making the country great again sounds exactly like the fascist movements. Concern about national decline, that was one of the most prominent emotional states evoked in fascist discourse. And Trump is using that full blast quite illegitimately because the country isn't in serious decline, but he's able to persuade them that it is. That is a fascist stroke, an aggressive foreign policy to arrest the supposed decline. That's another one. Then there's the second level, which is a level of style and technique. He even looks like Mussolini in the way he sticks his lower jaw out. Yeah, and also the bluster, the skill at sensing the mood of the crowd, the skillful use of media. I read an absolutely stunning account of Trump arriving for a political speech somewhere out west, I think, and his audience was gathered in an airplane hangar, and he landed his plane at the field and taxied up to the hangar and got out. That is exactly what they did in 1932 for Hitler's first election victory. Now, at the same time, he says, I doubt it's conscious. I don't think he's a bookish man. I'm sure he's never read a book about Hitler or Mussolini. And more specifically, more substantively, he says in the area of programs, the fascists offered themselves as a remedy for aggressive individualism, which they believed was the source of the defeat of Germany in World War I and the decline of Italy, the failure of Italy. World War I, they perceived national decline. They blamed on individualism, and their solution was to subject the individual to the interests of the community. Trump and the Republicans generally, and indeed a great swath of American society, have celebrated individualism to the absolute total extreme. Trump's idea and the Republican plan is to lift the burden of regulation from business, et cetera. So, Martin, why don't you first talk about, do you think Trump is a fascist, or instinctively, or in a calculated way? What do you think?
Well, I think I should start by saying that I think the word is a little bit overused.
Okay.
I mean,
Paxton thinks so too. I
Yeah,
mean, he
I
thinks it's a
know, I
cliche
know.
to right away, but.
I mean, to
Go ahead, yeah.
harken back
Yeah.
to fascism of the pre-World War II and immediate post-World War II
Right.
period is to harken back to a period when democratic regimes were really under fire.
Right.
And they were under fire by a kind of fascist populism. I would prefer the word right-wing populism, which we can carve out from fascism. I think that pretty much describes what, to an extent, not so much Marine Le Pen, but Jean-Marie Le Pen and Trump are really about. Jean-Marie Le Pen had his origins in the waning days of the Fourth Republic and was pretty good at mobilizing people. And that's what Donald Trump is good at as well, in all the ways that Paxton describes, and I would certainly agree with. But since Paxton is an historian, let me use an historical weapon for a moment. At the end of the 19th century, British political parties were beginning to open up and were beginning to mobilize a mass electorate. And a book was published at the beginning of the 20th century by a man named Moise Ostrogorsky called, I think it was called Political Parties, but it